Hi, Diarmid, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ward, and thanks for having me. Pleasure to see you.
I'd like to start off by talking about your background, which, if my memory serves me correctly, started in the northeast of England.
I was probably a fairly unremarkable student that just happened to be quite smart at maths. And as I sort of grew up in my teens in the northeast of England, I was like, well, this is no use to anybody. What am I going to do with it? And I didn't really have a plan. So like all good, sensible people that don't have a plan, I saved all my money and went to New Zealand. Bear in mind, this was a long time ago before I could have sort of looked it up on the internet to work out where it was. All I knew was it's a long way away, about as far from the northeast of England as you can get, and there are sheep. And I went to work on a sheep farm in New Zealand. We won't talk about the sheep themselves because that's a whole personal conversation that we don't want to start on. But I fell in love with the country and fell in love with the place and thought, this is a great place. This is where I should be. After a while, I kind of reached a conclusion with pressure from my parents that I needed to go and study and get a degree and make something of myself. And so I moved back to the UK to go to study maths and computing because that was apparently what I was good at. Only to find that after 2 years, I really didn't like that at all and went and got a job. And my very first job, on my very first day, I walked into the office and they said, come and see this. And I walked into this room full of computers. And it was one of the first businesses in the UK that was operating a service called electronic mail, which was very new and exciting at the point. And everyone dialed into these mainframe computers over the telephone lines with modems and sent very boring text messages to each other, which we now would think of as incredibly primitive. I was the technical guy making all those machines work for a few years. And I fell in love with technology, with actually working. It was kind of fun. And that was probably what started my interest in technology and just what I do now. But after a period of time there, I moved back to New Zealand to do exactly the same sort of role, but for a startup for the New Zealand Post Office, New Zealand Telecom. That lasted for a while. I changed jobs in New Zealand and eventually ended up in Singapore in the mid-90s. Computer systems, services for telcos and particularly telcos who wanted advanced technology such as store and forward fax and voicemail. These were things that would exist over very primitive leased lines around the ocean, bypassing the telephone network and communicating now that we take for granted, but in parallel to the phone network at the time. Happened to work for a business that was successful during dotcom and came out of that, and then ended up working for Cable and Wireless for a while, both in their regional role and then in a global role, running their wholesale business and their network, and eventually moved into Equinix, where I went back to data centers and sort of fell in love, I think, with the new concept of what data centers are, what we do with the technology and the applications at the center of the internet. But all my life has been involved in sort of communicating both, from over distance and what eventually became the internet.
That journey that you've talked about there, I think, you mentioned Singapore, you mentioned New Zealand. I think that's also taken you to Hong Kong and Japan.
Hong Kong and Japan. I was fortunate enough to live in both those places. I lived in Sydney for a couple of years. I've done my share of living around Asia and enjoyed the places. Every place I live, I love and enjoy and kind of try to get to know and understand a bit more. But I've been very blessed.
Evidently, I'm quite partial to an international adventure myself. But
yes, you are. Peru, I believe, at the moment.
That is right. But it always impresses me when I talk to people who were doing this 20 to 30 years ago, because, I don't know, but it seems to me like it would be a much bolder and more unusual thing to do than it is today, just given how less connected and globalized the world was then. It seems like it would be more like, really, you're going into the unknown.
Yeah, I think you're being very generous, honestly, Ward, because we didn't know any better. I think looking back on it on a lens now, you say, 30 years ago, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have the backup, you didn't have roaming phones, you didn't have all this ability to communicate and see stuff. But we didn't know any better, so we just did it, and it was just a fact of life. And I remember when I first moved to New Zealand, I would speak to my parents once a month, if I was lucky, from a phone box. And you go and put coins into a phone box. And now if I don't speak to my daughters at least, or hear from my daughters at least once a day, I start to panic thinking something terrible might have happened to them. And so I do get it.
Let's fast forward to today and focus on, the last 3 or 4 years of your career, which has been at as CEO of ESR's data center business. So for any listeners who aren't familiar with ESR, can you describe what you're doing there today and what's distinctive about ESR's model compared to some other more traditional data center developers?
So ESR themselves as a business that's been around for a fairly long period of time, developing logistics and technology sites around Asia. We have around $150 billion of assets under management around the region, and have been known for building high quality commercial assets in the key economies of Asia, both being backed by private equity, sovereign funds, and then for a period we were listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. We've just recently gone through privatization. A few years ago, decided to get into the data center business. Like many of the property companies are looking at now, the business said, well, we're very good at acquiring land, we're very good at raising money, we know how to permit, we know how to get power, we know how to deliver assets on time. That skill set ought to be useful in the data center business. So we set up the team in 2021, 2022, really to focus on having the core data center skills in a central location, but leveraging the reach and skills of ESR around the region to focus on markets like Korea, Japan, Australia, India specifically, where you're seeing the explosive growth of data centers. ESR has a good land bank of sites, some of which may be being used for logistics today, some of which might be which are the usable for data centers, but also we have access to new land, working with partners to deliver data center solutions in locations that might be difficult for other operators to get to, or they just want to expand faster and want someone else to take care of the build and creation of that business.
Could you maybe give us a bit more insight to some of the developments that you've been working on?
I mean, we are incredibly bullish on Japan. As a business, as ESR, we've had a historical logistics business there, which delivers up to 2 million square meters of logistics sites every year. So we've got strong track records in the construction industry there. Started off with our first project in Osaka in 2022. We started construction then. We delivered that to the market at the end of June as a fitted out leasable building, which is currently in fit out by a customer. That's kind of 3 odd years from where to go to get that thing up and running. It's part of a campus of sites, which we subsequently joint ventured with Cloud HQ from the US for. And we see that as delivering core central Osaka capacity for many years to come. Because it's a good 100 megawatt site with highly resilient fiber and lots of good power coming onto it. And of course, it's in Japan where the market's growing, and there is a constant demand both from traditional hyperscalers as well as the new AI customers as they come into the market. We now have probably around 350 megawatts of different sites around Osaka in 4 sites. So we see that as being a core market for us going forward, one we know, one we're comfortable with, and our customers want. We have a couple of sites in Tokyo that we really like. One is central and one is out to the west. We see them as being fairly complementary. The central Tokyo site, very good for people that want that connectivity of downtown, and it'll be a nice big site when it's developed. It's got about 70 megawatts of power to downtown Tokyo, which is quite a lot in that market. But again, the Tokyo market is going well. There's the traditional clusters of Enzai. Now West Tokyo is growing. You've still got a lot of demand around central Tokyo. The third largest economy in the world, Japan's always going to be a market that needs data centers. Tokyo is a highly interconnected city. You've got great international fiber connections that only continue to expand. The population are just starting on a cloud journey themselves, but equally, given language challenges in Japan, you're seeing a growth of local AI, and both from a training and an inference model perspective, as the Japanese technology companies implement their own versions of AI in Japanese.
I used to do a tiny little bit of work in Japan back in the days before I set up my business, and I really did enjoy that. But it is an incredibly challenging market to operate in. You personally have a lot of experience there. ESR, as you've touched on, as a business, have tons of experience in Japan. Can you maybe talk me through some of the nuances to Japan and why ESR have excelled there?
We still use fax in Japan. There's still a lot of written material. Things like COVID and digitization and AI are changing that, but it's still a very traditional society in lots of ways. That's great, and it makes living there an incredibly enriching experience. But it also means that some of the ability to transfer applications into the cloud and online become harder, so that it's perceived to be quite slow in movement into the cloud. The reality is you've got a incredibly technologically advanced society where everyone has had access to mobile telephony way in advance of what we've had in the West for a long time. Japanese mobile companies have been incredibly market leading in terms of applications and delivery onto the mobile. People's personal expectations from a device in their hand are probably greater than a business's expectations of what they can do online. And I think you've got that slight imbalance there. Businesses are struggling to catch up just because of the tradition and the focus and the way stuff has happened. It's a really rewarding experience there because the general contractors, once you have a relationship with them, will follow you through thick and thin. And when they say they will deliver on time, they deliver on time. When they say they'll deliver on budget, they deliver on budget. The challenge today is that the market in Japan is incredibly tight for general contractors. So if you're a startup wanting to come into Japan and just build on spec, you won't get someone to build for you. They just will go, we don't know who you are. We'd rather deal with someone we're used to. ESR has excelled by working with the local construction companies in a Japanese way. We're a very Japanese business, Japanese-led, and that ability to engage with the local construction market as a Japanese entity is what gives us a differentiation point in the market. If we try to be just another foreign data center company or construction company, I think we would fail rather rapidly.
Can we maybe talk a bit more broadly about your view on the APAC market as a whole right now, and maybe what you see as some of the differences between APAC and like the US or Europe, for example?
Yeah, so I think the answer to the question really sort of comes around how you think of regions. And so you look at the US today, and you've got the core markets which have been going forever, like Virginia and the West Coast and Chicago, where have been data center markets forever. These are now becoming increasingly saturated, and whilst still growing like crazy and still getting power, you're seeing the market moving to places that in the past would not be perceived as being data center clusters, like Iowa and Arizona, where land is cheap, power is more available, and the new AI economy companies can build these large data centers on relatively cheap land and have faster access to power. In Asia, we're seeing much less of that. The training models are generally smaller, it seems, and you're not seeing regular announcements for gigawatt sites that are going to be credibly built in the short term. Part of that is because a lot of the training by nature will be in the US, because that's where the data is and that's where the chips are and that's where the expertise is. But I think also it's just in many of the economies in Asia, we see higher power prices, higher land prices, longer times to build. So when it comes down to, I've got a bunch of chips and I want to do something with them quickly, global providers go, well, I'll put it in Europe or North America because it's just faster and I'll get my return on my chip investment faster. Training is important, and training will happen, and training will be isolated in lots of, or maybe not lots, but large sites around the world. Inference will be where the money is, and inference will be what continues to sustain and grow the industry going forward. As we talked a little bit about earlier, I think we're a bit behind in cloud rollout in Asia compared to the other two main regions. And that's more just about timing and user acceptance and again, priorities of global providers. You're seeing more hybrid solutions being rolled out, which are a combination of cloud and AI. That's densifying the bills. But again, we're seeing that being very manageable within the DC industry. You're not having a vast number of data centers being built today around Asia that are multi-hundreds of kilowatts per rack in terms of specification. You're seeing them in the high decimals, sort of under 100 kilowatts a rack, sort of as a broad spec. And I think that focus allows us to be a little bit more measured as to how we look at growth, because the challenge in the growth markets in Asia is power. And then you've got new emerging markets like Malaysia and Thailand, where power is seemingly no challenge, but demand is yet to be proven. So I think we're going to see those markets start to come forward as demand grows, but that's not going to happen in a year. You're going to see that happening over the next 5 to 10 years. And there will be stumbles on the way in some of these markets.
Can you maybe talk about what is planned for the future? What can we expect to see over the coming years? You mentioned a few other markets outside of Japan. What can we expect?
If we're constantly revising our 5-year plan, I'm not sure I can give away all the trade secrets, but we're looking at further investments in the markets where we know there's a demand, which is obviously Japan, Korea, Australia, India. That's where ESR has historically been strong, so we focus on those. That's our differentiation is our ability to build in these markets efficiently. So we need to be able to leverage what we're good at. You're not going to see us aggressively target a new market where ESR's core business is not there today. There's no real push from our investors, from our shareholders to do that. I think the focus is really on double down where you're good at, react to opportunities in non-core markets, but continue to focus on the core markets because there's still plenty of demand out there. I mean, if you look at demand in any of the markets in Asia and then try to compare it per head of population, per GDP, per whatever measure you want, it's behind Europe and North America.
I'm going to finish on a question that I ask everyone. So could you give me your thoughts on what you believe people in the industry aren't talking about, but you think it's important that they should be?
I should have studied other people's answers, shouldn't I? Look, I think people are talking about most things that need to be talked about. The reality is I think we don't focus on them enough. And we're still not talking about gender imbalance and the ability to hire more women. Don't focus enough on ESG and how we can give back to the communities we work in. We see pushbacks on data centers because people don't want square boxes at the end of their street. I think we have to do a better job of explaining to local communities how these data centers change their lives. The reality is we're not, as an industry, doing enough to encourage the power generation companies to deliver that power to us. Now, whether that's about sharing perhaps some of the upside of our investments in our data centers, I think if you look at the investment community, they would rather invest in a data center than perhaps in a power generation business. But one doesn't work without the other. So there needs to be some sort of balance there as to how do you deliver a project that really can deliver sustainable power and sustainable future, as well as a data center in one site or in one investment. And you may be compromised a little bit on the returns on the data center, but you get boosted returns on the power. Something along those lines, I think, as we struggle to both green the grid and provide enough power for our industry, I feel like we need to be focused on that a bit more. And I think the thing we don't talk about is what's happening with the evolution of AI algorithms. We think we understand what's happening with AI, or we don't understand what's happening with AI today. It's a rush for power, it's a rush for rollout, it's a rush for land and a demand for data centers. The industry is in the early stages. We need to think about what that evolution of the AI industry looks like. Does it continue to demand as much power? Does it continue to demand ever increasing rack densities? Is that where it's going? We're assuming it does. I don't think anyone knows the answer.
Certainly going to be fascinating watching how this all plays out over the coming years. Really appreciate your time. Always good to chat with you, Diarmid. I wish you and ESR all the best as you continue to develop the business across APAC.
Appreciate it, Ward. And, it's things like this that make me glad. I spent my career in telecoms. You're in Peru. I'm in Singapore. It's like we're next door to each other. I'd love to take personal responsibility for it all, but it's been great. Thank you.
God bless the digital infrastructure space. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Diarmid. Yeah. Bye.